starts doing the things to spell out Pinky, I love you in their code by hurting herself. And then the first thing that happens is they go up to a door so that a door can open into her to spell it's the letter S, and then the door was P, I believe. And then Pinky opens the door and it hits Twilight. She's like, I got, insert Pinky sense here. They're like, wait, that was on her list. Like, no, that's the Pinky sense for someone's about to do something incredibly stupid for romance. And I figured that had to have been you. What were you trying to do? And she's like, oh, I was gonna spell out Pinky, I love you in Pinky sense. And Pinky's like, oh, wait a second, is that what this is about? And it's just this moment of these two very unique traits of I want to study everything and I'm a little bit different and have this unexplained ability that comes together and brings them together. So it's a very unique how they hooked up. And I've never seen that kind of thing happen with any of the other ships in the fandom. Only with those two very different characters, but it works when they show them together.
So you've explicitly brought up the idea of chemistry, and I'm pretty sure that's basically what you just had your thought about. So I'm curious, when we refer to chemistry in characters, when it occurs strongest, I'm wondering, does that most often come from shared interests between the characters, as you might see in, say, a Rainbow Dash Spitfire ship? Or, as you've alluded to with Pinkie Pie and Twilight, I think we can all agree that they don't have a whole lot of interest to overlap between the two. What is it that defines chemistry between two characters?
So the question is, what is it that defines chemistry between two characters? I'm going to just repeat questions to make sure the cameras pick it up. Horizon, do you have any opinions on this?
Shared interests, as you've mentioned, is something that can be part of that. I think the idea of chemistry is more primal. You also have the category of romances of the as the new Twilight Sparkle's Secret Ship Pick Folder card game released this con tells us it's something like Punch Punch Kiss, where you have characters who really have nothing in common, shouldn't just hate each other's guts, and yet they work so well together. There's something more beyond just shared interests that just is about the characters fitting together in ways that I think even they don't expect a lot of the time.
That gets played with a lot because love and hate are very passionate emotions. And it's fun to play those up and make one come from another or something like that. That's kind of older than anything.
Yeah.
For chemistry, shared interest is a big thing because you find people who intellectually stimulate each other, but then you always, whether it's TV, whether it's in real life, you see a lot of couples that are together and they don't necessarily share a lot of interests. One of the big things about chemistry is more of a physical attraction. And if you want to talk about physical attraction, there's a few things you can talk about. There's the way someone a character or a person or a pony looks can be physically attractive, but then there's also things like smell, because it turns out that people who share similar DNA don't smell as good to each other. So people who have, I want to say they specifically narrowed it down to people with different immune systems actually will share interest in the scent of each other. And they can't explain it because it's not so much a scent of smell, it's more of hormones. But there's certain things like that that people will find attractive to each other. So if you have a pairing like Twilight and Pinkie, they're very different, they might not share a lot of interests. Well, you might have smell be something that interests them, because on a primal level, that's something that will cause two things to attract. You have different things like the Freud's whole thing about guys want to grow up to marry the mother, girls want to grow up to marry the dad isn't true, but there is research to show that people will be attracted to others who share some traits with the parent, because, and this makes sense if you believe in evolution, because it would make sense that the being that raised you successfully to adulthood has good traits to raise kids. So then if you see someone else who has similar traits, one, you're familiar with it. You know what's going to happen, because when you talk about romance, a lot of times you're talking about two beings coming together and then having, procreating. And so there's different aspects of that can be worked in. So if you want to have a really intellectual relationship, you can do that. If you want to have shared interests, you can do that. And if you want to have physical attraction, you can do that. And I want to say that if you see people that they meet when they're 12 or 13, and you know what, they've only ever gone out with each other, they marry, they're with each other until they're dying the day, and in some cases literally die on the same day, is when you have everything lined up, because they're always perfect together, they're always attracted to each other, regardless of, older or younger.
Well, I don't think those romances are actually any fun to write about, because when everything's perfect, then there's no conflict.
When everything's perfect, it doesn't make for a very good story. I will say that. However, you can have a background pairing. Isn't that cute?
Yeah.
Lyra and Bonbon, you see this all the time, where they're just together because they're together, and you don't see any problems, but they're in the background.
And in my opinion, I don't think there's any universal chemistry, at least in a literary sense. I think there are probably as many ways for ponies to have a good chemistry with each other as there are pairings of ponies.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, and I think even if two characters did grow up together and are really close, sometimes that can create a stronger friction between them, because they know each other's flaws so well that sometimes it can get so weird.
They're in their teens and they're already an old married couple.
Yeah.
Exactly. I think that can be a lot of fun to write.
Yeah, I agree. Go ahead.
I like what was mentioned once about Amy and Rory in Doctor Who. Like, one of my favorite lines from that whole arc was when she's talking about Rory. And she said something along the lines of, you meet people, and sometimes you meet them and you think they're really attractive, but then you get to know them and they're not that great. But then you meet someone and you're just like, oh, okay. But then you get to know them and they just kind of become beautiful to you from the inside, and I really enjoy that, because it really is a fun definition of getting to know someone and how that can grow.
You see that a lot in some Disney movies and stuff like that, where the nerd, oh, no one cares about the nerd, but then the nerd does something grandiose and romantic, and suddenly the nerd is just, everyone's like, oh, why can't you be like that?
Well, one of the recent stories that I read that had a really good romance part in it, which was kind of unexpected for the subject of the story, it was A Stitch in Time, and the characters that they shipped were, one was Twilight and one was a non-canon character that they completely made up, and as you progress, they add more to her character, and she's also really kind of different and the same as Twilight. And they have a lot of conflict, and it makes their romance really good. And it was just surprising seeing this in that kind of story.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely about the, again, kind of coming back to that chemistry, the psychology between the characters. I'm going to say, I think that the overall idea of romance is you have these characters that have these weird edges in between them, and you're trying to find out the way in which they go together. It's kind of like clicking a puzzle piece into place.
And you have to find your way to make it work. It's not just who do I like most, but who do I like most together. I mean, you can try and jam two pieces together, but they won't fit until you can try and make it.
It's why in a lot of romances, actually, you see a lot of extra backstory being added or extra personality traits, especially in fan fiction, that aren't in the show. It's also why you tend to see occasionally life-changing events, maybe, if it's something like you have, well, Rainbow Dash ships with everyone, so that's a bad example. So maybe if Pinkie wants to go for a flight and Rainbow Dash is busy, Fluttershy will take her up flying and almost drop her, and then realize that, if she really, really cares about Pinkie, it'll raise the question, but then Pinkie will realize, I might not be able to throw parties tomorrow. I might not be able to be with my friends. I've got to make the most of her time, which for Pinky, thinking that she hasn't been making the most of her time would like set things up like, I have no idea what's going to happen. And then you could, go into, she's, you've had that exhilaration, and Fluttershy saved her and stuff like that. So, she might, look at Fluttershy first, and then the characters themselves find out how the pieces fit because they're looking for it. They don't find them magically lined up because of circumstance and then decide to be together.
Pinky in a deep existential crisis is a story idea I'm going to have to steal here.
I think that was called Pinkie Pie Watches Paint Dry.
It was. It was a low blood sugar induced existential crisis.
Yes.
In the back.
I know you mentioned conflict and friction so far, but does the friction have to be in between the characters? For stuff like forbidden romance, a lot of the friction that comes is from an outside source. Could that work too? Or what are your thoughts on something like that?
So the question is, where does working friction come from? Does it have to be between two characters? I would
Romeo and
say,
Juliet?
yeah, I mean, honestly, friction elsewhere can actually increase the romance because if, Romeo and Juliet, the houses are at war, it makes that connection more meaningful. It provides contrast. I mean, it's the whole thing we were talking about yesterday throughout several panels was that, if you have fear or loss, you need hope. If you have friction, if you have things aren't going right, you want something to go right. And so if you start seeing a romance work, suddenly that one thing in your life that's going right has all that more meaning. If you're in college, if you're, just lost your job, if you're super stressed about other stuff that isn't going right, but you know what? You have this person there for you, you will appreciate that person so much more. And I think you can write that into stories. You see that a bit in University Days, if people are familiar with that romance, where Octavia's mom is causing stress for Octavia, and Vinyl's there for her, and it helps her appreciate Vinyl because she's never really had anyone be there for her defending what she wants.
At that point, what you're doing is you're balancing the good story is going to revolve around some form of conflict versus a good romance is about two people being happy together. So you're taking this process of two characters enjoying each other very much, which does not make for great literature, and you are trying to make it compelling. And whether that if that comes from outside, then then what's going on between your two characters can be more pure. If there's something going on with one of the two or between the two of them, you can bring the focus in a lot tighter, but you're not going to get the payoff of that romance until the end.
That one had his hand in the front for a while.
It's just, I guess, an add-on. There's also the domino effect. Friction elsewhere can cause friction between the characters, and that group is a really common one, and it's common because it works.
Yep. He was saying that friction from somewhere else, the domino effect, that it can cause more things. I forgot what you said.
Cause other friction in between.
There you go. I was making sure they could hear.
Well, and for friction, there's so many different types of friction. You can have, a threatening event. You can have just something being stressful. You can have differences of opinions. You can have different interests. You can have exploring interests different ways. And I think one of the ones that people don't see as much but can be a big problem in real life romances is differences of opinion, because we've gotten so attached to our opinions a lot of times that you won't see someone who's completely anti-gun and completely pro-gun in relationships a lot of time, because there's so much other things surrounding those that when they come together, like, that's where tension comes out. So you want to be aware that, like, the domino effect, other things can be at play, and a lot of times you get romances where there's conflict and it's brought out, one little thing brings out a bigger thing, brings out a bigger thing, and that happens in real life romances where something's been bothering people but they haven't wanted to let it go. or they haven't done anything about it. So they start laying out one thing, and then just other stuff comes out.
Well, on the subject of different types of conflict, going off of what he was saying about ship that he didn't expect in the story it was in, do you think there's any fundamental difference between writing romance in a fic that's not romance-centric and writing a specifically romance fic?
I think it's easier to write a romance fic without, or that's with something else, and that's honestly how I prefer to see romance 90% of the time, because if you only focus on romance, it's the equivalent, it feels the equivalent to me to having a crush, and everything's reminding you of this crush, but you know that things aren't. Like, you're like, look, I have this crush on this person, that's fine, they might even like me back, but I have other things I want to be doing. Why does everyone keep bringing up this thing? Or if you break up, why is everyone bringing up this person who I just broke up with? I mean, you get that a lot in romances where characters break up and then everything's reminding them it's very stressful, very annoying to the character. And when you have a solid straight romance, it's really easy to have too much of that, where it's too much romance and you don't get to just enjoy it, you're contemplating it too much.
Well, I think part of that comes down to in a romance fic that is purely about romance, you want to see characters grow and resolve, and if it's about two characters getting together, you only have, you can only develop that idea so much, and then they're together, and then you just need to start introducing new sources of conflict, or else your story is over. And if you keep writing, 50,000 words after your story is over, and there's Vinyl and Octavia, and nothing bad is happening, and they're just waking up in bed every morning, you're gonna lose eyeballs. Yeah.
There was a really good article that Wonder G posted, and Kit's, the author of Twilight's List, posted in, or about, and he talked about something called February fiction. Yeah, where it's pretty much just, I like this character, and it's all about, oh, will they like me back? And of course they're gonna like him back. And the whole conflict is the getting the nerve, or going up, or they randomly crash into each other, and it's just like, hi, I love you, yeah, I love you too, the end. I think I've described pretty much almost all of those.
Yeah, well, it's how you, depending on the point of the story, you can actually have a romance that does everything wrong, but because that's not the focus, like you can have the focus being like, the entire point is this character is proposing to this character, they know they love each other, they've talked about getting married, they just can't get up to nerve, and it's a romance, and there's no conflict, there's no external conflict, there's no romantic conflict, there's no question if they get together, there's no impending doom, there's no anything, it's just all in this character's head. But that's something we can all relate to, is being in our own head and causing ourselves grief over something that we're fairly certain will be just fine. So depending on how you do the story, you can do stuff differently, just depending on what you focus on. You can do the same thing everyone else does, but it's still a different and unique story. Super Trampoline.
How would you compare and contrast writing short form romance, for example, Horizons, Fuse State, or Thou Goddess, and long form romance such as Pony Sympathy and Deja Discord by CCAT?
Pacing?
Well, Deja Discord, you did that for NaNoWriMo originally, right? Like that's how you got the basis for it, and then she's turned it into three fics is the goal?
Yeah.
And so it's a romance spread over 3 different fics, where there's conflict in all of them, correct?
Because it's not just, see, I did a thing where it's not just them eventually getting together or eventually learning about their feelings for each other. It is also sort of my version of Discord's redemption. And it's not just, love conquers all. It's also about him learning and becoming friends with other ponies. And at first, it's just friendship, but then it kind of...
Well, and in that story, Discord has to learn to be pony enough, like to relate enough to the ponies for that romance to blossom. So there's a lot of character growth because you are taking two characters that are very different. And it is a very challenging thing to do. And you see that works better for long form. Short form, you tend to see characters that, the pieces are already a little bit more lined up. Spitfire and Rainbow Dash. You tend to see stuff lined up. You see a lot of stuff based off of the show. Soren really liked Applejack's Pie. Well, the first romance fic I wrote was It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, which has nothing to do with the show It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, but it was an interesting romance because Applejack and Soren happened to be in the same spot when something went different for both of them, and they just decided to hang out. Well, they're playing off of the fact that in the show, he likes apple pie, she made the apple pie. Well, they both show up to this apple convention, and it turns into this, cosplay something, or no, the apple convention was actually canceled. And so she traveled all the way to New York for the convention that was canceled, which never happens with any other. But they came there for the same reason. The pieces are already lined up. They have a shared interest. Now they have time and they're together and they have nothing to do. It's a short form story and it's really easy to do that very naturally. So shared interests, you tend to see a little bit more for a short form where people are doing something. Maybe one character's, maybe if it's Twilight Rarity, you have Twilight's, been trying to learn to sew and has been spending time with Rarity and then realizes she really gets along with Rarity, and Rarity is, they just, once she started getting on the same level, they were just so in sync and perfect, and, Rarity is very pretty, and, you just start, the pieces just start falling into place.
And, sorry. I just want to note that Pony Sympathy originally was just one scene. It's the first scene in the whole story, and...
Which story?
Pony Sympathy.
Okay.
And that was just going to be all I was going to do, but then I expanded on it, and you might see a bit more rush in the first chapter because I was trying to do what he was doing, which is find a shared interest. And so I actually did find something for Twilight to grab onto and say, hey, we're kind of similar in that way.
The one thing I wanted to touch on in regards to that shared interest, one of the best blog posts I've seen on the topic of romances was Book Player mentioned once upon a time that one thing every romance novel needs, and this applies to your short stories too, is to have the two characters that are getting together talk about something besides how much they are in love with each other.
Yes.
And the shared interests is a great way to do that in a shorter story because what you're doing is you're building that chemistry, you're showing the audience the fact that these work together rather than just saying OTP. You're actually displaying, showing the work of what brings them together, and that is, selling to the audience how this pairing is working.
Fluff is fun, but it can give you a tummy ache.
And cotton candy.
Yeah.
Going on the long form, something that I've been trying to want to work this fic in, and there's so many ways to do it, but this is a great point. There's a fic called Near Death Experience by Hadels, which is a really old fic, and it's, for all intents and purposes, there's absolutely no reason why this fic should work, but it is entirely engrossing. You will say, well, I was just going to read a chapter and go to bed, but you know what? I'd rather not sleep. It's one of those stories you can't put down, and it's a pony dies, and she goes and she meets death. And there's a few other ponies there, and Death has having a slow day, and the other ponies convince Death that, hey, you're bored, there's not a lot going on right now, how about we play a game, and if we win, we live. They're like, okay, so the other two ponies either fail, or I think one of them cheats or something like that, and they get sent off, and hers is like a series of questions, and she answers them, and she gets sent back to life, and so she wakes up at the bottom of the hill she fell down, and it's a very morbid story because it's dealing with death, but she's utterly fascinated by this character that she met, and she can't get him out of the head. And it shows that something that's completely different to a character, a completely new experience, can start intrigue, not necessarily romance, but an interest. You see this a lot, if you've ever seen the show Dharma and Greg, You have the stuck-up, raised by a business family, raised to be a lawyer, has aspirations of being a congressman, very proper in San Francisco, but that's whatever. And then he meets this girl that's completely free will. Does what she wants, is very much a modern hippie, not necessarily the idea of drug hippie, but in the 70s it was more being at one with nature and the environment around you, and a lot of the friendship and the magic of friendship and stuff like that. And they're very different, and they end up finding it very attractive to each other, and they get married the day that they formally meet. So Near Death Experience by Hadels is a really good example of that, where one character sees another. It's just so different that they go back to experience it again, and then it turns into, Death has never had anyone show this much interest in him, so suddenly he's looking at her differently because she's doing something that's so much different.
This conversation is going to turn to crack shipping sooner or later, isn't it?
Maybe. Well, that was a long.
I think you just did.
You mentioned pacing. There was one that I think in particular I read in the past. It's called Eternal, and it was more focused on the secular platonic relationship between Twilight Sparkle and Princess Celestia as like her mentor, and how an integral part of her life is. Do you believe there's a fundamental difference between the character and bond relationship development between a platonic relationship versus a purely romantic or physical one, and how they can be derived from each other as far as the writing style?
Well, there's 4 different types of love.
Repeat the question for him.
Oh, repeat the question. Well,
So the question, I believe, was, is there a difference in pacing between something more platonic and something more romantic, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
so there's the 4 different types of love. I do believe C.S. Lewis made that popular. Eros, that's the romantic love. Filio, I'm probably pronouncing these wrong. That's the friendship one. Agape, which is everlasting, and storge, which is familial.
I've always been a fan of the triangle theory of love, where you have commitment, you have friendship, and then you have passion, and which romance goes with that. And you can have any one of these 3 and love someone for that. Like, I have my best friend, you'd say we have a very platonic form of love, and it's formed a lot in friendship, but we've been friends together so long, we're basically brothers, we in a way have commitment. You also tend to see that happen with characters that maybe they started off with a romantic relationship, now they're married, they're older, they still get along, but maybe that passion has gone away. And whether you have each of the corners by themselves, the combination of any 2, or the combination of all 3, you have a different type of romance. And a lot of times romance is the struggle between these to try and get all 3 of them together.
And I think that to answer your question about pacing, the key there is going to be that passion, as Paiko was just saying. If you are exploring a more platonic relationship, you're not going to get quite that level of passion in the almost violence with which they come together or potentially go apart. You're going to have something that's more gradual. It gives you the luxury to build it up a little bit more slowly. Although maybe not necessarily quite slowly as Eternal. It is very good. I have heard if you get to the later chapters, I have to confess that it's one that I was not able to make it all the way through myself. But
And you do have to be careful with the intensity, because the readers will pick up on stuff, because we, as fandom people, pick up on stuff that not necessarily was meant.
Well, and with pacing, a lot of times with pacing, what you're dealing with is you're trying to change some aspect of the relationship. Because if you have a couple that they've been, they always run off and end up together in the same bed at the end of the night, and you do it again. That's a very standard pacing. What people usually refer to when they're talking about the pacing is wrong here. It's you're seeing a change, but the pacing isn't reflecting that change in either the relationship or an aspect of the character or the situation at hand. And so when you're getting to more passionate aspect of relationship, there's a buildup. There's a reason why in dancing, the guy dips the girl at the end, it causes heart to accelerate because they're falling for a second. Well, but the body, says, oh, my heart's aflutter, and this person who I like is holding me, and it will increase that attraction. It'll help increase that passion and that pacing between that relationship. Whereas if you just suddenly they're making out for no reason, it doesn't make any sense. I mean, that's why you have the hands touch. It can be a spark. It's suddenly like this went from just someone's hooves. Sorry.
Yeah.
Suddenly we drop something, so we're picking stuff up. To suddenly our hooves are touching, and suddenly that tone, that pacing has just changed. But there needs to be a valid reason for that.
Although technically, since ponies would pick things up with their mouths.
Well, that happened.
Don't be a great talk where it starts.
I'll give you a hoof. No.
So to continue a bit on that topic, one of my favorite romance authors, Rurik, who wrote Fire and Rain, has said on his blog, one of my favorite quotes is that the thing that ruins a romance the most for him is the characters playing, quote, tonsil hockey in 10 seconds flat.
Yeah.
Gee, I wonder what that's in reference to.
He's noted that this happens a lot even in longer form romance, that the pacing independent of the word count can seem wrong or too fast or too forced. How do you go about making sure that the flow of the romance is, I guess, believable or relatable?
Okay. I'm going to use an example from when romance is included as a side plot. If you have a character going off to fight the penultimate evil and their romance is going to be at home, there's a reason why they will go from like, we like each other, we said we'd wait till the end, to, you might not come back. Like I know we faced stuff before, but this is going to be like, I honestly don't expect you to come back. There's a reason why when characters do this, and there's kind of this unspoken agreement to stave off the relationship until later because they don't want to have hurt feelings. Suddenly, they realize that it might be over before it starts, where they engage in more. And if there's a reason like that, it makes a lot more sense. There's a reason why a lot of my favorite romances are subplots. It's because a lot of times it's a lot easier to have jumps in pacing because the story is already winding up. It's the same thing, a guy dipping a girl, getting heart rate up. Suddenly, there's a little bit more passion there. If they're building up for war, they're building up for this big other conflict. The tension, and in real life too, carries over. And a lot of times, there's no tension, there's no lead up. It's just, one character sees the other character, they look good. Hey, tonsil hockey.
It must be hard to play hockey with your toe.
It must be. I mean,
I can't see it apart.
For pacing, I'm actually going to mention a story by Colden Gardiz by the name of The Glassblower. It is a romance. It's a tragedy, but it is about a romance. In it, the central character, who is an artisan who works with glass, falls in love with Rarity. He just basically bumps into her in the market one day and falls hard.
he pulls a spike.
Yeah, and the thing is, this is a thing that happens in real life, and it is, crushes, that sort of instant falling in love, you can do. But in his case, what he did is the glassblower falls in love with Rarity, instantly falls to his knees and blah blah blah. She says she's not so sure of the whole thing, and so she basically just sort of shoves him off with the task and says, I will give my heart to the artisan who can make something that is worthy of me. And he immediately goes back to his studio. And then you have this great series of exchanges between him and his friend who comes in and says, "Are you nuts?" And the thing is that you get, what people want to see is some acknowledgement that sort of instant falling in love, it happens, but it's a little bit crazy. And when you have two characters that are just falling for each other, that can snap a reader's suspension of disbelief. And so you want to address that in some way. If you are accelerating the pacing, and the more that you're accelerating it, the more you need to be aware of this. What you want to do is you just want to acknowledge that. You want to make sure your characters are acting in ways that are reflect the suddenness of this coming on, and you want to give that pressure an outlet somewhere, like the friend who is trying to counsel them, or them taking a long walk and stopping and thinking about this and saying, "What am I doing?" Acknowledge in some way that the readers are going to need to be sold this romance, even if in your character's head it's just perfect from the get-go.
Hang a lampshade on it?
Yeah.
Earlier you talked about romance as a subplot in the sense of like romance developing. Still with romance as a subplot, would you have any other advice for having an already established romance being the subplot?
So the question is, with regards to subplot,
How do you make that interesting?
how do you make a romance interesting if it's already established?
Like if the couple's already together, if they're married or something?
Like-
Yes, and
Maybe
then
like a
the events
sequel?
of the story.
Like a sequel to
How-
a story or something?
A lot of people don't think that you can keep a married couple interesting after they get married. That was one of the reasons for that whole, what's it called? That Spider-Man arc.
Wednesdays.
Wednesday.
One More Day. That was the whole reason for that. And that was also, I think, why we were almost not going to get that extra season of Kim Possible. Because Kim and Ron got together. Well, they're together now. What can we do with them?
I mentioned earlier my own story, Fugue State, is about Lyra and Bon Bon having a fight and breaking up and reconciling over Lyra's fear of musical numbers, which is just something that, in a way, it's a romance, but the romance is almost a subplot to this exploration of, how that works in Equestria. So the key is, is conflict, because a story needs a good conflict.
One thing I would say to this is that to understand how to make a continuing subplot interesting, you need to understand a little bit more about romance and how to get characters together. And the reason why is when you see a couple together and they're happy for a long time, they have fun together, they have inside jokes, they have, I'll talk about it in symbolism and literary device, but the rose is supposed to be the romantic flower, and a lot of authors will just put a rose in because it's traditionally romantic. However, there's a lot more meaning if, hey, when you thought I was about to die, there were these dandelions there, or there's this flower that you use to maybe it's a big leaf or something, you put it over the wound or something like that, you saved my life with this plant. Now this plant has personal meaning to us. So this personal meaning you can have with characters, and not just themselves, but the outside world, it adds a lot of fun. It adds a lot of extra intrigue, and you feel like you're on the inside of something. It's the equivalent of you can be part of whatever group you want. You can be a brony, you can watch a show, but until you go and you meet people and you suddenly develop friendships, and you find other people who, maybe Twilight Discord is your favorite ship, and now you have this personal connection with other people, you can't really explore that relationship. So I think I jumbled that a little bit, but by making it personal and fun and including the reader in that, it is satisfying. So you can have maybe a character help them get together. Maybe they'll always hang out with that character, but when that character's around, they always look at him. They always give that character a nod, or they give her a nod, and there's always this sense that person helped the couple get together and stay together, there's an extra connection there. And when you understand this, you can write it into the story without being explicit about it, and then you have something that feels a lot more like Greek literature, because you get a sense of something without it explicitly being told that they nodded at him for getting them together.
So I'm just wondering, in terms of how would you approach a ship that has 3 characters as opposed to 2? Because in some fans, OT3s are really popular. I've just been wondering what you would do that's different from a regular 2-character ship.
She asked about OT3s. I've never written.
I'll take this head on. I don't care.
Yeah.
What do I care about my reputation? When you're doing 3 characters together, honestly, the best thing to do would be research. There are films out there for that lifestyle in the real world. You can look at that. You can also have a lot of times you see it where a light version of that is when you have like one character that's interested in 2 characters who are interested in that one character. Whether it's 2 guys interested in a girl and she's interested back or the other way around. And it's a conflict, and one pair will break up, then the other pair will, and then that one character that broke up will get together with the other character, and then they won't know.
Archie and Betty and Veronica have been doing this for 60 years, just so you know.
Yeah, and you know what? It's still reasonably popular.
Yeah.
I mean, it's been going for 60 years. So that might be something you want to take a look at. But I mean, you need to establish, are all the characters friends? Are all the characters interested in each other? You need to establish everything you need to do for a single ship, for a single pairing, between all 3 characters, and sometimes the pieces won't line up, and you have to be aware of that, depending on how you write it.
Well, building off of that, one truism that you'll hear is that in a romance between 2 characters, between 2 ponies, there are actually 3 characters involved. There's Pony A, Pony B, and then the couple. And the dynamic between the couple is going to be different from when these ponies are out on their own. And the same thing applies exponentially as you grow a ship. So if you have 3 different ponies that you are writing about, then you have character A, character B, character C, character D, character E, character F, and character G. So then you get up to 4, and I'm not even going to try to run out of letters for that. But, so yeah, there's a lot more to write about, and you can certainly focus on specific parts of that. But if you're doing an OT3, you definitely want to include at some level all of the permutations and show how those affect the other ways that the characters interact.
I would also say you're probably going to do a lot of rewriting. Don't do it for something that's that complicated to keep track of, especially. Write it out, preferably the whole thing, but write it at least a few chapters in advance, because you'll come up to points where you need something to happen between one of the characters, and the way the other character would realistically react might be counterproductive to your story, so you need to establish something about them earlier that makes it more believable how you want the story to go. So you might be doing a lot of backtracking, because it's the equivalent of, in Star Wars, the first 3 films, during the climaxes would keep track of 2 events. You have in the Return, the New Hope, you have you have the Star Destroyer, or the Death Star. You have the big space fight. You have the base, the Rebel base that's going to be destroyed, and they go back between the Death Star and the Rebel base, but it's mostly the space battle. Well, when you get to the new stuff, Episode 1, you had the fight in the palace, which was very important. You had the fight in space, which was very important. You had the fight on the ground, which, in retrospect, wasn't very important, but it was important for the plot. And so now they're balancing 3 important things with lots of action and jumping between them, and it doesn't connect as well with the viewer. So you're going to want to spend more time balancing out what you focus on, because you might find that, hey, it's 3 characters being shipped together, but I'm spending half my time on these 2, or a quarter of my time just on this character alone, and then 50% with this character, with this pairing, and then, hey, this other character's here too. So balancing it out is a lot harder to do, so you'll want to write ahead.
Would you we say it would be even harder to do as a subplot if it like wasn't the central thing?
I would say it's easier because with subplots you can be indirect.
Yeah.
Stuff can be happening behind the scenes that you don't have to explain. You don't have to take time on it. So for balancing out how much exposure you have, stuff can be going on behind the scenes. One character can confront another. It's a quick explanation, even if it might be tense, of what's going on. So you don't have to spend as much time on it. But if romance is the focus, you have to balance out very carefully. If romance is the subplot, it's okay to not include all the romance directly.
I would actually disagree with that.
Differences of opinions.
Yes.
Oh.
No, because because for almost the same reason he said that you know, you need to be more careful about showing all of the components of the relationship. You know, when you have fewer words to do that, I mean, you can imply a lot of the glue between them, but then you're kind of losing the benefit of writing about this OT3 in the first place.
That's a very good point.
Yeah.
I would say there's something I believe a bit in, and that's plot or character-driven stories. Romance is usually character-driven. The plot is there because things need to move for there to feel like there's any accomplishment. But you can start writing a romance one way and it ends up a different way based on the character interactions that you go with. But the characters are the things you're connecting with. When you have a big story, I was assuming that it was an objective-driven subplot. If you have a character-driven subplot, then I would agree, it would actually be really hard to do. So, again, definitely plan it out, get extra opinions, bring someone in every once in a while, because as you've been, if you've been working with 1 or 2 editors, pre-readers, they know all the changes you've gone through. They effectively may have read 2 or 3 times as much of the story as will actually be published, based on discussions and stuff. So every once in a while, bring someone else in, see how they feel it's balanced out with that missing information.
And there is a difference between OT3 and love triangle, right?
Yeah, I was thinking more like shipping a trio of characters, for example. It's really common.
Let's do, you haven't done a question yet.
I guess I'll go ahead and answer the OT3 part of it. There's a video game out there. It's kind of old by now, but it actually has like, you know, it does everything that you guys said. Has like the long overarching plot, but the plot is good, but it tends to just almost serves as an excuse to both show all 3 characters playing off of each other, and sometimes just break the characters up into different permutations, show how they play off themselves. And it shows the chemistry basically just between all 3 of them, and by the end you can see how well they work apart and how well they work together, and by the end you are pretty much convinced that they are completely inseparable. That game is called Skies of Arcadia. It's you probably get on GameCube right now, yeah. But yeah, if you want to see pretty well done 3-way, they never outright say it's like a romantic relationship, but it's very easy to infer it by the end of the game, so give that a shot.
Okay. Super Trampoline.
What are some of your guys' favorite unusual ships? You can't answer this so like we already know that.
Aww.
The question is, what are some of our favorite unusual ships that you were about to talk about?
Well, in Pony or in anything?
Mostly Pony, but if there's something else.
I'll jump into this if you guys want a moment to think. I'm really happy with the Snapple fic I commissioned. Snail's Apple Bloom. When Snails is done right, it's developed a very interesting way, and it's being told retrospectively. So after Snails and Apple Bloom have been together for a while, Twilight decided to do research on romance, and they've been together for a while and she knows them and stuff, so she asks them how they got together, so they're telling their 2 sides of the story. And so it's all being done, well, on this day is when it kind of started, and then they go from there, and then sometimes they'll have differences of opinions or stuff will be happening that the other character didn't know about. But the Snail's Apple Bloom, if done right, where you make Snails really smart, but just not necessarily fast. He's slow, but he's smart. was really interesting. I talked about Pinky Twilight, and then I talked about Death and an OC called Pinwheel, who's just a cookie cutter background character. I mean,
That does sound interesting. I don't really read a lot of crack ship or ones that I would consider crack ships in Pony. It really depends on people's taste, what they think is a weird one. Well, there is like that one that I mentioned, Rainbow Dash and Kitchen Sink, but that's only because everybody ships her.
I love crack ships. just gonna put that out there now. There's actually a really a good one in a literary sort of way.
How dare you?
Between Tom and Bloomberg.
Oh yes, yes.
So you have this rock and this tree that are in completely different areas of the country, and yet they feel this sort of psychic connection, and the tree's roots start growing towards Tom over the course of several centuries. It actually works.
This is a different one than the one I was thinking of. Bloomberg and a Tom one, yes,
Yeah.
where it was Tom kept rolling towards Bloomberg, and Applejack was freaking out. It's like, why is this rock every morning it's a little bit closer to this tree? It moves the rock back over, and it's Tom, and then next morning the rock's a little bit closer to the tree, and it's like, I don't know what's going on. I didn't even know that rocks and trees could feel love. Those are really fun. It's not that they're great romances necessarily, but they're really, really funny and fun, and it's a romance centered, but you're building off of that to be something else.
Yeah. And I think what makes a crack ship work is the author being able to sell that there is some sort of connection there.
That you don't understand.
Yeah, and that drawing of new lines is something that delights me no matter what genre of fiction I'm reading. So, I love crack ships because it forces the author to put in that work and really gives me something genuinely new.
One of the things that inspired me to write my Pony Symphony one was what some people consider a crack ship, but I've researched it so much it doesn't feel weird to me anymore. It's from The Incredibles. Syndrome and Violet. Age difference, a bit significant, but it gives me that villain and hero thing that gives me automatic conflict that I love so much. And you also have to get over the whole fact that he died at the end. And
Spoiler.
oh yeah, spoiler.
You hear through a writing panel. There'll be spoilers here.
But that was
watching for the first time.
at first I was like, that is a weird ship, why would you do that? So I looked it up and I read the fics and I really enjoyed them. Usually though they do age Violet up.
Yes.
Oh, no, sorry, go ahead.
Something people do a lot and usually not particularly well is shipping an OC with an established character. Do you have any advice about that?
Don't make it self-insert.
Well,
Yeah.
No self-insert, no Mary Sue. Make sure to have your punctuation check. No.
Check your punctuation out, you are. I should probably take a stab at this because Thou Goddess, which I wrote, was exactly that. It is
Self-insert.
Well,
Really?
no, it was Luna by OC, and yet somehow it's like ended up on a bunch of people's top 10 lists of their site-wide, fiction reading.
It's a great story. Yeah, it's really good.
And I think the trick is to slide it in. You don't want to say, have Luna walk down the hall and say, oh, there's an OC and he's so great because he's an OC. No, you need, at that point, the requirement to sell the ship becomes doubled, tripled. And since you're writing a story with an OC in the first place, you need to have some other hook to get readers in the door. Stories with OCs are just going to not be read as much. That's just something that happens statistically because people are here to read about the ponies we already know.
Really good ones, people will say, normally I don't like OCs, ship it, but if someone does a really good one, it's the equivalent of saying, someone wrote a really good story, it happens to be about ponies, this is an established character, this isn't.
Yep.
The only one I remember reading and really enjoying is Shipping and Handling. And that puts did see or derpy with an OC, but again, it's, you know, over the course of the story, and it's a bit more subtle, and I enjoy that.
Yeah, and I mean, part of that is, I mean, with shipping and handling too, is that you have some other hook, and then the romance kind of is the bait on that. And in Thou Goddess's case, it was poetry. You have a character who is a poet, and all of the correspondence that's coming back and forth, they don't actually even meet until halfway through the story. All of this is a romance through correspondence. And he wakes up in the morning getting these letters he's not even sure are from Luna in the first place. And so, I mean, there's something, you know, in that case which is pulling people in before that chemistry even comes into play.
Especially for romance, that kind of thing where there's something special, interesting going on to begin with, will entice a lot of readers. Now, one thing when you're talking about OCs, you're talking about making your own character. When you're making your own character, a lot of people don't actually know how to do that properly. I would argue even a lot of these very successful, well-written characters, they don't necessarily know how to do it properly. They happen to do it properly a lot of times. And so when you're making because when you're using a pony from the show, you're using an established character, you can look up reference material, you can look up how different show authors did it and choose to include or exclude what you want. When you're making your own character, you have to go deeper. You have to think about how they interact with different characters, not just the main romance. You want to make sure that that you've explored more than just what would happen in the story. Whenever you're in doubt and you want to make a character or a world better, write more in your head than never makes it to the story. Because what you'll do is you'll find stuff will come up and like, hey, I was going to have this be something happening in the background, but this would be, it would fit perfectly right here. And so now you have a lot more personal, a lot more fluid story that feels a lot more real, because that happens in real life. We're like, oh, you know that person? I know that person too. And so you get a little bit more connection between characters. The world feels a little bit more fleshed out. With OCs and romance, you need to have the personality down. You know, what were they like when they were little? Where do you see them when they grow up? Where are they right now? What are the things they've been having problems with? Their weaknesses as a character, their strengths. Who else do they know? Are there other OCs that they know that interact with? Then you have things like, what has the non-OC character been in a relationship before? You have to flesh out their background in relation to your story. So flushing out all that stuff, there are some real-life authors who will have more, like for each book, they will have more than a book written on the side as notes. And because, I mean, J.K. Rowling actually did it. She had totes and totes and totes of ideas. And she actually got to the point where she could include them all. So when she needed something, she would reach into her tote and pull out something random. Does this work here? No. Put it back, find something else. You know what? This would be really cool here. So she just has totes and totes and totes of ideas that never made it into her story. And now she's gone off and written some different stuff, and that's fine. But one of the reasons that world feels very fleshed out is because there was a lot more there that we'll never get to see. Hello. Welcome to the panel on romance.
Yeah.
Anyone else have any questions?
Hey, just to sort of like kind of bounce off of a point that we had a few minutes ago about, well, odd shifts in the sense of characters that you don't always see. You know, just to, this is something that I think isn't done enough, is actually taking some of the really background characters and actually trying to shift them with some of the characters that we already know, because since those characters don't get a lot of screen time, and not necessarily, you know, like Lionel and Derby, because they aren't on the screen a lot, but we already know so much about them. But I'm talking like, you know, Cloud Chaser and Roseluck and all those folks that you just don't hardly see more than like 5 or 10 seconds, right? They're kind of blank slates, right? So we can build more on them. But, so I guess to raise that into a question, you know, how far can you really take that, trying to build character, or to basically build a character that we don't see very much, without making them seem like, okay, I haven't seen Cloud Chaser for more than 10 seconds, so she's totally not like that, right? So is there like some sort of a ceiling on that, I guess?
So the question is, how would you ship, and how would you do shipping a background character that we don't know as much about with one of the more main characters?
Right, it's more about like trying to build characters that we don't see much at all without them seeing so
how do
far out.
you build characters that we see in the background into something that could be a romance with the main characters that we see more of?
Right. Yeah, sorry.
I think a lot of that is the same thing. You want to make sure you have the characters really fleshed out. You want to build up a backstory. Also, it helps if you lead it into the story. So if you're going, we don't like see Bonbon interact with Twilight, on a personal level in the show. They talk in passing a couple of times. You could have it where it starts off a little bit slower. They mention, oh yeah, I'm going over to Bonbons to get these candies and stuff like that, and you establish that they have more interaction in the world first, and then it leads into a romance. That's the advice I would have.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a lot of the same things we said about show characters and OCs. It also applies that, is that you need to sell the character, sell the ship more when you're not starting from that base of, taking somebody's existing OTP.
Super Trampoline?
Would you say the rules are any different for writing romance when one or both of the characters is immortal or very long-lived? Obviously, that goes on a lot in this family.
There is a classic story in Greek mythology, Greek and/or Roman mythology, where one of the goddesses fell in love with a human, and she's immortal. He's not. So she asks and has him grant. It might have been not necessarily one of the goddesses. It might have been one of another character that can live forever. So she asks for immortality, and he gets immortality because it's granted to her. There might have been a boon involved or something, but the thing is that he still gets older. He still wastes away, and he gets to the point where he gets so weak that he turns into a cricket, and that's how crickets came to be. That's a very extreme example of extreme, thoughtful example on how immortality happens. So when you're dealing with immortality, you have a lot of loss. You have, it'll end prematurely. And one of the ways to make that still feel fulfilling is children, is to have legacies, to have some other sense of accomplishment other than the romance itself.
Was when you were writing your Twilight by Discord, was this before Alicorn Twilight?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was in 2011, right after Discord premiered.
Okay. So how did you handle that in your story?
Originally, I was going to go the route a lot of people go, and have the, like years later when the immortal or really older character has lost that loved one, and they're very sad about it. And there's a lot of those. Even with Alicorn Twilight, before she became an Alicorn, it was always that, they can live the rest of their lives with this character, but they can't live the rest of their lives with that one.
I think that the difference between mortal romances and mortal romances and immortal romances kind of gets back to just the difference between mortals and immortals in the first place, where those sorts of issues come up, and I think the romance magnifies those. But that's kind of a whole separate ball of yarn on its own.
They could think about things differently.
Yeah.
They think of time in different ways.
And if you really want to get into the head of an immortal, romance is a good way to do that, because it's something where you get this burst of passion and then this sort of long tail. And for somebody who thinks about time differently, that they're going to approach that differently than somebody who that's new and fresh for them.
And there you go, more conflict.
Yeah.
Something else you can do is, and you see this sometimes, and I've seen it done. There was a really famous one back in the day where Twilight fell in love with Luna, but Luna's like, look, you haven't been in love before. Go be in love with someone else.
Oh.
First, come back to me. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. It's a little bit more adult, but it brought up the point of a character can fall for an immortal and can be with an immortal, but the immortal stays the same. Whereas, after 1,000 years, they're more established as a character, as a personality. They have their habits. But the other character will keep growing. And I mean, one of the big things about romance in real life and in stories is characters grow old together. They grow and learn and experience. They overcome obstacles for the first time together, like having kids, and then they move on together. But in immortal, that might not necessarily happen. So you can't have a mortal falling in love with being with an immortal for a time, and then they've grown and they're a different character now, and the immortal isn't. So now you can have either the struggle between the immortal and the regular character, the immortal trying to change, trying to adapt with the character, or the immortal moving on. And so that's another option you can go.
Well, I wanted to, because your degree is in psychology, how exactly would romance work between a person, like a quote-unquote regular pony, and say a pony with DID, like pony as a fair example?
DID, dissociative identity disorder?
Yeah.
Got a super damsel in distress.
Yeah. Whenever you have, and I'm going to expand this out to anyone who has any disorder of any sort. Whenever you have someone who has a disorder, you're talking about a abnormal personality trait of some sort, whether it's mechanical in the brain or whether it's emotional, or just certain things set them off more. A lot of times it's self-confidence. Can be a big problem, but you are dealing with a problem and you have to show the romance despite that. And then usually it's a character, the other character, learning to deal with that. It's the same thing if a person falls in love with someone who's disabled in a physical sense, maybe they're missing a leg or an arm or they're blind. They have to see something special about that character, and then one of the actual points of friction can be dealing with it, because like if you have a blind person in real life and you move your furniture around, suddenly it's harder for them to get around the house because they can't see the changes. You have to let them know. It's things like that. And so research whatever disorder or disability that a person has, read actual material from people and for people with the disorder, see what challenges they face and write those into the story. And then you can have the other characters deal with them, and be aware that it might be harder to make it believable, simply because if you haven't been in that situation, it's really hard to understand. And if you don't just want to end the fic, if you realize you can't do it, you might have to end the romance.
Also helps if you know or can find someone who has had a disorder.
If there's someone that you know can talk to you, that's a big thing.
Suze?
Oh, that's very long, right? Any advice for writing ugly romances? And what I mean by that is where they don't fit perfectly. Because I'm working on writing a story where a changeling is discovered to replace this pony's husband. The pony convinces the changeling not to kill her. The changeling convinces the pony not to report her. And so now this changeling and pony, for the good of the kids, have to try to live together while hating each other. Any advice on how to show that antagonism?
So the question is, how do you, any advice on writing romances in which the characters don't actually like each other? Is that?
Yeah, but
it's love-hate kind of, it sounds like.
Yeah. Well, you certainly have your source of conflict built in. I guess under that circumstance, the thing to be aware of is find a reason that it actually works, because the conflict is not a problem, but now you have to, if you want to turn it into an actual romance, two people just thrown together in a situation where they hate each other, I want to say aren't going to start falling into each other. I mean, which is not strictly true. You have things like Stockholm syndrome, but you also want to be able to advance that in a way that's not going to make the readers throw the book across the room. I mean, if you get to the and the pony's falling in love with the changeling because the changeling keeps abusing her, readers are going to be like, ah. We'll let the psychologist handle this one.
Love-hate relationships are hard. Usually what happens is, for a love-hate relationship, usually love starts first. Things happen where they find out that they don't necessarily work together, and then it develops more towards hate. And the problem with that is, the reason why it's allowed to build is a lot of times there's still a lot of passion, and being angry at someone is very similar physiologically to being attracted to someone and being in a more happy state, let's use. And so the thing is that it will transition into hate in a way that at the time seemed acceptable, because in a way they're still being in a relationship. Well, now you have the problem where all there is hate and that passion, and there's no romance. Now, what you're talking about with two characters coming together who dislike each other, you see a lot of times they'll find something that, like, maybe the changeling will do something nice for the other pony or something like that. You'll see little acts of kindness or convenience for one character or another. Maybe the changeling will kind of be found out and will need the other pony to help cover. It's like, look, and it might be under a threat or something like that, but usually it's more of a, I need this help. Like, you'll be in a situation where you can turn me in, but let's be fair here. I haven't hurt anyone. In your situation, it sounds like the changeling replaced the pony, but you see situations like this where I haven't hurt anyone. A more classic version would be like an escaped prisoner. Like, look, I'm in prison for something I didn't do. I can prove it. I was never allowed to prove it. It was dismissed for whatever reason. I've never hurt anyone. I've never done anything. But can you back me up on this? I mean, you've known me. I haven't taken anything. I haven't hurt you. I've gone out of my way to be helpful and stuff like that. Not necessarily say that explicitly, but you can build off of the, I dislike you because of X, but X was based off of prejudice. So now you're switching it into a love-hate relationship, into a perceived or a hate of something that isn't necessarily there. And when you reveal that to not be there, then you can have a romance or a friendship grow.
Yeah, and I think that's a good way to sort of establish character growth. When you have that sort of thing happening over time, that and especially that sort of conflicts, it really gives characters an opportunity to look at themselves and examine their own actions and behaviors, and as they change, that's a great hook to start setting that romance angle if that's where you want it.
I watch a lot of movies, and at the end of a lot of movies, dude kisses a lady. But the movie's not about dude trying to kiss a lady. Or there's a wedding. Lord of the Rings ended with a wedding, right? But it's not about a wedding. It's about getting.
No, it ended with a coronation.
Say what?
It ended with a coronation.
Yeah, sure. But they got together. Actually, it rode away.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is, there's a lot of stories that have romance in them without being about romance, and sometimes the romance is used to support the central theme or the central plot of the story. And I'm wondering if y'all could give us ways to, in our stories, support a more central theme, or have like a romance as a side plot without making it feel shoehorned in, or still making it feel something integral. Can you maybe give some rules of thumb or examples of good kind of romance as support?
So the question is, can we give advice or examples of romance as supporting subplots, to a wider story? We did touch on that a little bit earlier. I think the takeaway, I would say would, I would say the takeaway for that would be that a lot of the same things we've already been saying, that you want to have a source of conflict either within or outside of the relationship as a source of tension, and that can play into your larger plot. And if you already have sources of tension from your larger plot, that can lend itself very easily to just sort of shoehorning the romance in. And we seem to be running a little short on time, so I'll cut that short.
There's a lot of anime that does it really well. There's a lot of anime that does it really bad. Fallout Equestria does have a good romance as well. It becomes a little bit more of a direct focus for a little while. A lot of times you see the romance ending up at the end as kind of like a closing, like people are just closing up subplots. So it's also a way to indicate that the story's over, to make it feel complete without feeling like you need to add something else, because you're just wrapping something else up that people already know is basically wrapped up anyway. So, I think that'll be it. Some of us will be up here for a few minutes, but we do have another panel in here in 15 minutes, and that would be symbolism and literary device. So, and the hero panel later today will have Heather Ball on it, which is one of the comic writers. She wrote the Celestia Micro. So we are going to get a lot of people in here. If you want to line up early, that's fine. You need to do so outside.
Thank you.